The 12-hour fuse. How one man's vote stopped nuclear war. Practice depth charges thud against a steel hull south of Bermuda. Inside the Soviet sub, heat claws at lungs, the air tastes like batteries. One officer grips the safe with a special torpedo. Another says the Americans are attacking. A third says they're signaling. Above them, a US destroyer circles, certain it's sending a warning. It is. Nobody reads it the same way. Washington thinks the brakes are on. They aren't. A secret Soviet operation has already slipped warheads into Cuba. There's a 12-hour fuse, an invasion plan buried under code names, and one submarine vote that won't go where anyone expects. Operation Anadyr, the cover story that worked. To understand why the ocean boiled that day, go back to one word, Anadyr. It sounded like winter, a river in the Far East, boots in snow. That was the point. Khrushchev needed a mask that whispered Siberia while ships steamed for the Caribbean. His reasons stacked. Berlin bled prestige. Havana sat 90 miles off Florida, fragile after the Bay of Pigs. Most of all, American Jupiter missiles in Turkey pressed a finger to the Soviet throat. Parity without waiting for factories. If Washington kept weapons near Leningrad, Moscow would park them near Miami. The gamble, speed, secrecy, and American assumptions. Anadyr wrapped everything in misdirection. Soldiers drew parkas and felt boots to sustain the winter lie. Manifests promised tractors and irrigation pipes. Crates labeled agricultural equipment hid launchers and missiles. Radio silence clamped down. Even captains learned the truth at sea, letters opened under KGB eyes. In New York, diplomats soothed, defensive aid, nothing more. Fidel Castro accepted because it meant survival and pride. Exiles trained in Florida. Another landing felt inevitable. A Soviet nuclear umbrella made that landing suicidal. But he wasn't fully in the loop. He knew the outline, not the triggers. Havana would learn later how far Moscow was willing to go and how far it was. In Moscow, Anastas Mikoyan backed the move and banked on negotiation if discovery came early. Timeline was leverage. The faster the deployment, the stronger the hand. In Washington, John Kennedy faced a hawkish military strung by Cuba's 1961 fiasco. Robert McNamara believed in controlled force. Air Force General Curtis LeMay believed in decisive blows. Personalities set to collide with assumptions. Scale hid inside the crates. The Soviets moved not only R-12 MRBMs and planned R-14 IRBMs, but tactical nukes, FKR-1 coastal cruise missiles, short-range lunars, and nuclear bombs for IL-28s. Warheads followed on the Indagirka on October 4, 1962. That battlefield kit made any US landing a nuclear proposition. Command authority for those weapons, if invasion severed communications, was intentionally ambiguous. Under bombardment, decisions might devolve to colonels in cane fields. Meanwhile, the American lens blurred. After Francis Gary Powers' U-2 Shootdown in 196 and a U-2 loss over China in 1962, risk tolerance dipped. Weather scrubs in September weren't reset fast. Coverage gaps opened as Soviet convoys rolled off Cuban docks. Refugees reported long trailers under canvas, pale Russians guarding fenced compounds. Analysts flagged SAM sites, the fan-shaped SA-2 signature, but national estimates leaned defensive buildup. The deception exploited American habits. Soviet lies at the UN were expected, but planting strategic missiles in Cuba felt reckless, even irrational. Analysts overweighted what they thought the Soviets wouldn't do. Maskirovka worked best on belief. It didn't just use camo nets, it pressed on cognitive shortcuts. On the island, crates moved under palm frond screens. Cuban militia guarded perimeters they didn't fully understand. Night convoys slid through Matanzas, headlights taped. A Soviet officer rehearsed FKR drills off a dirt road, measuring arcs toward beaches American planners knew by name. He didn't need the code word ORTSAC to prep a kill zone. Khrushchev believed speed could outrun discovery. Erect launchers, train crews, mate warheads, then confront Washington with a fact. Trade followed. Remove your Jupiters in Turkey. Pledge not to invade, we'll talk. It was a bet on secrecy's shelf life. It almost worked. Kennedy kept the circle tight. George Bundy filtered intelligence. Dean Rusk weighed diplomatic paths. McNamara ran force ladders. The Joint Chiefs sharpened options: airstrikes, invasion, or a maritime quarantine. Each assumed there was time. Anadyr tried to steal time. Inside CIA's photo lab, a micro-story. A photo interpreter slid a print under a magnifier, traced the arc at San Cristobal, tapped a SAM nearby. Bomber runs just became suicidal. He circled a shadowed cylinder and scribbled 3 letters: MRBM. That pencil mark would walk into the West Wing and change the week. Meanwhile, something else was happening at sea. The Navy's confidence in signaling, sonar pings, flares, practice charges, rested on doctrine the Soviets didn't share. That mismatch would matter when steel met steel. Above the waterline, rules sounded crisp. Below it, heat, noise, and dying batteries translated pings into threats. The last sharp turn. By early October, Soviet warheads were dug in at Bajukal and Managua, guarded under earth berms, camo nets slung like laundry. Tactical units rehearsed under the same discipline as strategic sites. When the big fields went on alert, the small ones shadowed them. Beaches, airfields, roads, inside somebody's kill box. So when the photos finally reached Kennedy on October 16, the discovery didn't start the clock. It revealed it. The deception had held just long enough to load the island with weapons the United States hadn't imagined and to seed a command ambiguity designed for bombardment. Washington saw launches. It didn't see a 12-hour fuse laid across beaches and runways, or a Foxtrot safe with a single nuclear torpedo. The mask worked because it fit American expectations, until it didn't. Then the story accelerated. The missed signals, how Washington slept through the delivery. Here's where the clock should have slowed, and didn't. By late summer 1962, tips piled up like driftwood. Refugees told Coast Guard debriefers about long trailers under tarps slipping through Matanzas after dark, pale Russians guarding fenced compounds in the countryside, convoys that didn't stop at checkpoints. The flow wasn't the problem, the filter was. Analysts heard noise shaped by Excel politics and fear. They shaved away anything that sounded like strategic. Defensive build-up, sure. SA-2s, probably. Nuclear-tipped MRBMs in Cuba, unlikely. Meanwhile, 2 ghosts walked the lens. Francis Gary Powers' U-2 went down over the Soviet Union in 196, and another U-2 was lost over China in 1962. Risk tolerance shrank. September sorties scrubbed for weather weren't automatically reset. A single cancelled mission became 5 lost days. In those days, canvas peeled back, erectors drilled, and warheads were trucked under nets toward inland bunkers. The SA-2 fans jumped off film, petals around a guidance radar, classic signatures, but national estimates kept using the word defensive. It was technically true for what was on the briefing table that morning. It was strategically wrong. 3 days earlier, a source in Havana had sent a sketch. Long cylinders on cribbing near San Cristobal, paired trucks, support vans in a pattern he swore looked like a missile path. The drawing hit a desk already sore from false alarms. Over interpretation, someone wrote in the margin and moved on. While they debated, Soviet ships with deceptive manifests kept sliding into Cuban ports, and night convoys doglegged around towns with radios pointed at music, not traffic updates. Then the tactics shifted. The Joint Reconnaissance Center routed more low-level RF-101 runs around the island's edges, avoiding the thickest air defenses. The SAM threat pushed pilots down and out. The photos came back sharp but narrow. Mosaics missed the precise angles where revetments grew into recognizable launch sites. Meanwhile, the SAM belts hardened, radar vans tested beams, and searchlights practiced arcs across airfields that would soon matter to men in parachutes. Inside the West Wing, language hardened too. Briefers told George Bundy and Robert McNamara the build-up was serious but likely defensive. The phrase, "no evidence of strategic missiles," slid into talking points. It created a frame that would take a magnifier and a specific shadow to break. Kennedy, burned by Bay of Pigs advice, didn't want to leap at rumor. He asked for more coverage, caution and weather answered with fewer flights. Unknown to them, the Indagirka's cargo. Warheads for R-12s and FKRs, Lunars, and IL-28 bombs had already been offloaded by October 4, 1962. Technicians were racing through mating procedures behind camo nets strung between royal palms. Communications discipline held. Cuban militia manned roadblocks around dull grey warehouses without windows. Rumor said tractors. Guards didn't correct anyone. In a Langley photo bay, the frame finally hit the right angle. A young interpreter saw a long, ribbed tube and the skeletal arms of an erector, berms cut like a clock face, support vans lined nose to tail. He circled the cylinder and wrote 3 letters, MRBM, then carried the set upstairs before his section chief returned with coffee. That walk bent the weak. But even that reveal sat on top of a deeper blind spot. The analysts were counting launchers, not fuses. Beneath the strategic picture was a tactical minefield EXCOMM didn't imagine yet. FKR coastal missiles tucked near possible landing strips, Lunars assigned to beachheads, gravity bombs waiting for IL-28s if runways stayed intact. The invasion plans in Pentagon drawers assumed clean skies and runways. The island's dispersal plan assumed bombardment and acted accordingly. At sea, another missed signal hummed. The Navy believed in signaling, sonar pings, flares, practice depth charges preset shallow to compel compliance. The doctrine assumed the other side shared the dictionary. Soviet submarine commanders hadn't been briefed to read those patterns as punctuation. In a steel tube at 110 degrees with batteries dying, a warning sounded like an attack. 4 Foxtrot-class boats were already inside the quarantine ark, each with a single nuclear torpedo locked in a safe. Washington didn't know that variable existed. Captains would feel it. Meanwhile, intelligence tradecraft cut both ways. Cratology spotted common missile boats on decks and SAM gear in yards, but big cargo rode below. False manifests said agriculture, machine parts, irrigation pumps. The truth traveled by courier, not radio. Even Soviet ship captains opened sealed letters at sea under KGB eyes. Maskirovka wasn't just camouflage, it was diet. Feed the adversary what he expects to taste. By the time Bundy laid the first undeniable MRBM photos on Kennedy's low table on October 16, discovery didn't start the clock. It revealed one. Launchers weren't fully operational, but readiness curves had started to rise. Timelines in the room said weeks. Timelines in Kane Fields said hours once orders came. And layered beneath the debate over airstrikes, invasions, or a quarantine was a command ambiguity designed for bombardment. If lines were cut and Marines appeared, authority might devolve to a colonel with a code word and a truck. That's how Washington slept through the delivery, not lazily, procedurally. Habits trimmed outliers, whether trimmed sorties, doctrine mistranslated danger. The mask fit American expectations until a pencil circle broke it. And even then, the photographs showed less than the fuse already wired to beaches. Discovery, the photos that triggered the 12-hour fuse. The envelope lands on George Bundy's desk just after dawn, acetate still smelling like vinegar. He flips to a San Cristobal frame and stops, ribbed erector, cylindrical shadows on cribbing, berms carved like a clock face. He doesn't schedule a meeting. He walks the photos straight to the residence. Kennedy's in a robe when Bundy lays them on the coffee table and says, "They're there." Stakes lock in fast. Proof means options that can't be unsaid. Inside the Pentagon, plans don't wait for speeches. They sit on the edge of the runway. Airstrike, invasion, quarantine. Each one intersects pilots, Marines, Soviet crews, Cuban families and cities inside range rings that now touch Washington and Chicago. Kennedy understands the first move will write the second. Action tightens around a table that becomes a stage. EXCOMM forms. Rusk, McNamara, IFK, Taylor, Bundy, McCone, Dillon, Sorensen, with Llewellyn Thompson watching Moscow's mind. Briefers tap the prints. 4 MRBM sites building out, Sagula Grand showing activity, Sam belts like petals guarding the crown jewels. How long? Someone asks. Days to weeks for full readiness, they're told, but partial launch possible sooner. The room feels that phrase settle. Impact lands through voices. Curtis LeMay wants the hammer. Mass airstrikes, then invasion. You're in a pretty bad fix, he'll later tell Kennedy. McNamara runs ladders in his head, non-legal pads, arguing for a maritime quarantine to slow time and preserve control. RFK stares at the photos and says the quiet word that frames the moral problem, Pearl Harbor. A surprise attack, even on missile sites, would stain the cause they say they serve. Complication sits outside the frames. The island is already wired with tactical nuclear weapons, FKR coastal missiles for beaches, lunar rockets for staging areas, gravity bombs for IL-28s. Washington does know. Command authority is murky by design in case bombardment severs lines. If the United States bombs and then lands, a Soviet colonel in a cane field might be left with a code word and a choice. Meanwhile, what nobody in that room grasps, Soviet site crews aren't hypothetical. They're practicing erection drills, leveling guidance platforms, rehearsing fueling sequences under camo nets. Warhead mating is the last step. If time stretches, leverage grows. If time collapses, panic does. The clock people think starts today has been running since October 4, 1962, when warheads rolled off the Indegirka. The debate locks into the but therefore chain. Hit fast and you could decapitate the threat, but you'll likely miss some sites and kill Soviets. Therefore Moscow might answer in Berlin. Quarantine and you demonstrate resolve without blood, but missiles remain on the island for now. Therefore you live under a loaded gun while you bargain. Each scenario bends toward misread signals at sea and hair-trigger decisions onshore. Kennedy leans toward quarantine. It's a use of force with breaks, stop offensive weapons bound for Cuba, force a pause, open channels for a trade. It isn't neat. LeMay calls it weak. McNamara frames it as control. RFK sees a path that avoids the first shot while holding strength. The choice sets steel in motion that afternoon. One folder slides open like a ghost. ORTSAC, Castro spelled backward. Target folders mapped beaches east of Havana, drops zones for the 82nd and 101st Airborne, Marine landings, armored pushes toward missile parks. If diplomacy fails, paper turns to beaches. Nobody in that room yet knows that tactical nukes already cover those beaches. As speechwriters trim nouns, the Navy shifts. Carriers sortie. Destroyers lace a line. The order, quarantine, not blockade. Signal, hail, warn, stop and search. Doctrine assumes the other side will read intent from distance and noise. That assumption will be stress-tested by heat, sonar, and a Foxtrot captain whose batteries are dying. In the hours before the television address, the photos circulate like voltage. A CIA analyst murmurs, "We've crossed from estimates to evidence." At Strategic Air Command, crews sit on alert, engines ready, heads down. In Moscow, Khrushchev reads a cable and tells aides the Americans have found the sites. He still thinks there's room to trade. Turkey's Jupiters for Cuba's R-12s, a non-invasion pledge to calm Havana. Kennedy's address names it. Unmistakable evidence, a quarantine, a demand for removal. He avoids blockade. He leaves a door open. He warns that any missile launched from Cuba will be treated as an attack by the Soviet Union. Cameras go dark. Phones light up across capitals. The public clock begins. The private fuse, tactical and strategic, was already lit. Hidden layers push under the waterline. 4 Foxtrot submarines ride beneath the quarantine arc, each carrying a single nuclear torpedo. Washington doesn't know they exist. American captains will try to signal with practice charges preset shallow, thinking they're tapping out Morse. In a steel tube at 110 degrees, those taps will sound like war. Back in the cabinet room, a final beat reframes the map. McCone points to the range rings and traces a finger from Pinar del Rio to the Midwest. Thompson adds a human read on Khrushchev, impulsive but not suicidal, open to deals that preserve face. RFK suggests a backchannel. McNamara sketches a line of ships on memo paper and writes rules of engagement in the margins. Control, control, control. That night, the Navy holds station, SAC holds at the edge, and couriers carry drafts that will fly to Moscow and come back split in tone. One personal, one hard. The photos didn't just prove missiles. They forced a choice between momentum and friction, speed and control. The 12-hour fuse isn't a metaphor now. It's a window in which half-seen weapons can go from crates to armed, and a single misread splash can flip the table before anyone finishes a sentence. The Navy's tightrope. Quarantine becomes a combat zone. While speechwriters trimmed clauses, steel shifted. The proclamation went out on October 22. A quarantine, not a blockade. Lawyered language with carriers, cruisers, and destroyers moving to lines plotted in grease pencil. Ships slid into stations north of Cuba, radars painting lanes, signal flags stacked and ready. The Navy trained for intercepts. It hadn't trained for a dictionary the Soviets didn't share. Stakes were human and immediate. A wrong turn of a rudder, a misread flare, one shell from a jittered deck gun, and families in Florida and Murmansk would feel the consequence. Orders stressed control. Signal first, hail, warn, then visit and search. But doctrine is a language. In Moscow, merchant captains were told to run quiet, keep distance, and avoid boarding. Submarines in the lanes were told to stay deep, maintain radio silence, and slip if they could. Intent would travel by light, blast, and ping. Meanings would not. Action started with the line hardening. A Soviet freighter, Bucharest, held course for Cuba. The Americans tracked her on scopes and debated optics. Forcing a showdown on day one risked blood and headlines. Kennedy let her pass. The exception tightened the rule for the ships behind her. Destroyers spread into arcs, sonar traced layers, and an etiquette of distance settled over grey water that could vanish with one bad call. On bridges, laminated cards spelled choreography, flag hoists for stop, flares for urgency, radio circuits in guarded English, and for subs, a pattern of small preset charges dropped shallow, signaling grenades meant to compel a surface, not to maim. Sailors practiced the pings like drumbeats. They believed they were tapping out Morse. In Foxtrot-class boats baking below, the hull rang like a bell. The beats felt like fists. Impact showed up in micro-decisions that carried strategic weight. One destroyer capped in red, visit and search, as permission to crowd within 1,500 yards, steel looming to show resolve. Another held 3,000, giving sea room and time. Mixed pressure produced mixed responses. Some Soviet freighters slowed, engines thumping in neutral while radios stayed dark. Others turned back before reaching the cordon, a sign of Khrushchev buying hours. The ocean looked calm. The policy ran on nerves. Meanwhile, across the fleet, anti-submarine warfare manuals came off the shelf. Sonarmen talked in bearings and angels. Temperature layers bent sound, hiding contacts, and then revealing them with a snap. Helicopters skimmed low, dipping transducers, tossing smoke to mark turns. Aircrews saw deckhands on Soviet ships stare back across white wakes, unreadable at 200 feet. In cockpits and CICs, the rule was simple. Hold fire, hold position, hold nerve. Unknown to Washington, 4 Foxtrots, B-59, B-36, B-130, B-4, worked batteries and breath beneath that arc. Each carried one special, Torpedo, a T-5 with a nuclear warhead roughly 10-15 kilotons. Their orders were clear on paper and murky in heat. If under attack, defend the boat. If cut off and war had started, judgment would fill the gap. The Americans didn't know this variable existed. Their playbook assumed conventional cat and mouse, with rungs you could stand on. The Soviets had brought a missing rung. Complications multiplied with weather and pride. Night ops replaced horizons with scopes and phosphorescent wakes. A whale's moan could mimic screws. A thermal shift could hide a sub beneath a warm cap like a blanket. Young officers on American bridges felt the urge to own a contact, close it, push it, force a result. Chiefs of the boat and salty XOs bled that impulse into checklists and coffee. Control wasn't passive. It was a taught skill. A micro-story rides a Jacob's ladder. A boarding party on a US destroyer rehearses papers and phrases in halting Russian learned phonetically. The Soviet freighter's captain meets them at the rail, eyes steady, documents stamped for machinery, agricultural. Crates under tarps look like crates under tarps. The Americans log the visit, photograph, and climb back down, salt and sweat-soaking cuffs. They radio one word up the chain, compliant. The line holds. Meanwhile, in the sound room of another destroyer, a contact deepens and hardens. Depth charges, practice, set to explode shallow, go over in patterns. The ocean becomes percussion. Below, in a steel tube at 45-50 degrees Celsius, air thick with CO2, men count seconds between booms and decide what story the rhythm tells. The Americans think they're tapping surface. The Russians hear, "We're killing you now." Impact wasn't a volley. It was restraint winning by inches. A freighter reversed course 60 miles short. Another stopped dead to invite an inspection it knew would be declined in favor of optics. A US captain backed off 100 yards after a near-collision scare and didn't write the self-correction into his log beyond a bland line about station keeping. Each choice shaved risk without losing face. Parallel to the surface chess, a silent escalation crept forward. Strategic Air Command sat on airborne and ground alerts, tankers orbiting, bombers ready. The fleet's posture fed Moscow's picture as much as the president's words. One flare too close, one rotor dipping too low over a black hull, and a Soviet commander, sweat stinging his eyes, batteries sagging, might choose the special rather than surrender on the surface. The tightrope held because captains treated their orders like rails. Signal, hail, warn. Do not provoke. Keep discipline when adrenaline begs for a shove. The quarantine worked as strategy because it worked as seamanship. It bent without breaking, and it turned a map of arrows into a narrow channel where words still mattered more than wakes. But down in one boat, breath was running out, and the dictionary problem was about to become a vote. Submarines on the edge. The nuclear torpedo nobody in Washington knew about. Beneath the quarantine line, 4 Foxtrots fought heat, pressure, and time. B-59, B-36, B-130, B-4. Diesel-electric sent on a mission called Karma, told to lurk near Cuba and be ready to break a line they weren't allowed to acknowledge. Each carried 22 torpedoes. One was special, a T-5 with a nuclear warhead around 10-15 kilotons, sealed in a green safe that needed keys and consent. No one in Washington factored that into rules of engagement written for cat and mouse. The stakes inside those hulls were physical before they were geopolitical. Temperatures climbed to 45-50 degrees Celsius. Condensation fell like rain. CO2 thickened the air until lungs felt weighted. Batteries ran down as boats tried to stay deep and quiet. Food tasted like diesel. Nerves frayed. Sonar pings and shallow, signaling, charges turned steel into a drum. Each thud asked a question in a language the Americans thought was clear and the Soviets read as threat. Action finds B-59 on the day sailors would later call Black Saturday, October 27, 1962. Destroyers above, including USS Beale and USS Kenai, tightened a contact and dropped small charges preset shallow. On paper, the pattern meant surface and identify. Inside B-59, the hull rang, bulbs popped, men flinched. Captain Valentin Savitsky read the percussion as attack. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed and had one half of a key to the safe. The written guidance they carried: defend the boat if attacked. If cut off and war has started, act, offered enough space for fear. Impact hinged on a third man. As Brigade Chief of Staff, Vasili Arkhipov carried authority beyond his rank. He'd been on K-19 when a reactor leak cooked men alive to save their ship. He'd seen panic multiply mistakes. Now he watched sweat run down Savitsky's face, heard arm the special, and put a wall in the way. Not grand, just firm. He argued the pings were signals, not killing depth charges. He said surfacing could clarify the picture and save the crew. He added a harder truth: batteries were dying. Without air, they'd be blind and dead in the water. The doctor was already pushing salt tablets at men whose hands shook. Meanwhile, something else pressed. The safe needed unanimity on B-59, captain, political officer, brigade chief of staff. On the other boats, 2 signatures could suffice. Here, 3. That procedural quirk met a man unwilling to let a misread thud become a white flash under a destroyer group. Savitsky paced. Maslenikov nodded toward the safe. Arkhipov kept saying what sounded like a stall and was actually strategy. One more turn to cooler water, one more hour, then we decide with air in our lungs and light in our eyes. The stakes outside the hull were brutal. A nuclear torpedo detonated under a carrier or a pack of destroyers would vaporize ships and pull SAC into a script nobody could stop. An underwater flash would look like the deliberate opening of nuclear war. In Washington, the quarantine would turn into LeMay's airstrikes and likely into an invasion. In Moscow, seeing a sun under the sea, pressure to answer in Europe would spike. One misread signal could turn a cramped argument into a continental fire. Action slowed because the math forced it. Voltage sagged. Code 2 alarms chirped. An engineer gave a number that sounded like a verdict minutes to critical levels. Arkhipov used the arithmetic. Blow tanks, surface, breathe. If they're killing us, we'll know immediately. If they're signaling, we keep our men alive and avoid writing history with a key. Savitsky slammed a fist against a bulkhead and gave the order. Tanks roared, plates creaked. The bow rose. The surface was a riot of light and noise. Helicopters, rotor wash, flares, flags, loud hailers in English. Sailors staggered into sun like men waking in a furnace. Americans saw a black hull ringed by white wakes, men on deck, no guns firing. Signals moved. There was no boarding, no ramming, no shot. Above, officers read discipline. Below, a crew sucked air like a drug. The special stayed in its safe. Impact rippled long after the wake flattened. The US Navy thought it was tapping Morse. The Soviets heard fists. The gap wasn't cultural flourishes, it was doctrine under heat. Washington didn't know nuclear torpedoes rode under its destroyers. The rules of engagement had never been tested against a boat that could erase a task group in one blast. Add the unknown, and signaling looks like playing with matches in a dry forest. A microscene sits aft in B-59. Torpedo men stood by when the word came to prepare. Paper seals on tools broke. A crewman stared at the green hatch that separated them from the special and felt his stomach heave. Then the runner slid in with the count order, hold. The hatch stayed closed. He exhaled without meaning to. Years later, in a small apartment, he told a nephew he'd never again hear a door click without remembering that hinge. Meanwhile, the other 3 Foxtrots were running the same gauntlet. B, dodging contact patterns, B-130 nursing bad batteries, B-4 slipping under layers like a hunted animal. Any of them could have reached for the same safe in the same heat. On B-59, unanimity and one man's resistance caught the slide. On the others, the combination was different. That's how narrow the margin was. Clarify the record. Arkhipov didn't save the world with a speech. He used a procedural veto, experience from a reactor accident, and a gambler's nose for when momentum lies. He bought 10 minutes, then an hour, then enough daylight to keep a key from turning. In later years, when archives opened, officials in Washington learned for the first time that the variable even existed. McNamara's reaction to the nuclear torpedo detail was simple horror. The Navy's playbook looked different, with a 10-15 kiloton asterisk. The boat slid back under and away. Elsewhere, letters moved, inspections began, cranes lifted missiles into crates. But the fuse people talk about wasn't just diplomatic. It ran through a compartment that smelled like diesel and metal, where 3 men decided whether a thud meant signal or war. The answer that day was air and restraint. It could have been a flash. The invasion that wasn't. ORTSAC and the generals push. OB-59 gasped on the surface, Washington's pencils sharpened into bayonets. ORTSAC, Castro backwards, wasn't clever wordplay. It was a layered plan. OPLAN 312 for airstrikes, 314 for invasion, 316 for accelerated timing if the clock collapsed. The Joint Chiefs wanted more than missiles gone. They wanted the problem removed at the roots. Stakes ran hot in that room. Curtis LeMay had sack cocked, B-52s and B-47s ready to erase runways and SAMs. Maxwell Taylor worked the ground scheme. Marines eyed beaches east of Havana, Tarara and Kojima, while the Army slated armored spearheads through Mariel. Airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, rehearsed drops to seize San Antonio de los Banos and Jose Marti airfields. In their heads, it was Normandy with jets and better weather. Action lived in the checklists. OPLAN 312 started with suppression of enemy air defenses, F-105s, F-100s, Navy A-4s and A-6s, pounding SA-2 radars, fuel farms, MiG pens. Follow-on waves would crater runways, hunt mobile targets, and blind radars long enough for paratroopers to fall through the gaps. OPLAN 314 mapped the landings. Marines through surf, armor rolling from LSDs, engineers clearing obstacles, airborne brigades linking with beachmasters under smoke. OPLAN 316 tightened everything. 5 days from green light to jumps, amphibious waves hitting 3 days later. On charts, it was crisp. Meanwhile, their assumptions were wrong. Intelligence put Soviet troop strength at 10 to 12,000. The island actually held over 40,000 Soviet combat troops, plus Cuban regulars and militia. The chiefs assumed Cuban morale would crack under shock. Cuban doctrine wrote the opposite. Operation Cactus layered kill zones along every likely landing. Bridges wired for demolition, fuel caches set to burn rather than feed in advance. Complication hid inside crates the Pentagon hadn't counted. Tactical nuclear weapons. FKR-1 coastal cruise missiles sighted within reach of those beaches. Lunar rockets positioned to smash staging areas and captured airfields. 6 nuclear gravity bombs for IL-28s if runways stayed intact. In EXCOMM, those details didn't exist. On the island, Soviet officers measured arcs toward names that matched the Americans' beach lists. A micro-story sits in a hangar at Fort Bragg. A jumpmaster from the 82nd tapes a drop alt on a bulkhead, 800 feet, and walks his stick, tapping helmets. He's flown over smoke in training. He hasn't flown through an SA-2 belt with crews who've already taken a U-2. He looks at a photo of San Antonio de los Baños and sees a flat rectangle. A lunar crew 10 kilometers away sees a target box. While that was happening stateside, Guantanamo readied for war. A-4 Skyhawks warmed on the line. Marines studied inland ridges where Cuban mortars could bracket them. Offshore at Viks and Onslow Beach, practice landings ran under name nobody said aloud, ORTSAC, turning rehearsal into muscle memory. Leaflets sat in crates, Spanish warnings telling civilians to shelter as liberation arrived. An occupation proclamation waited in a safe, complete with curfews and weapons turn-ins. It assumed stunned compliance. Impact of those blind spots would have been immediate. First-wave Marines under white surf at Tarará, then a white flash from an FKR warhead raking a beachhead. Paratroopers landing on a runway already targeted by a lunar battery. Guantanamo itself inside a short-range crosshair. The chiefs promised low losses if surprise held. Surprise would have detonated the tripwire. Parallel pressure pressed Kennedy. The Maysaid blockade was weakness. Air power could clean the table in a day. Taylor assured him the Army would finish what the Air Force started. RFK kept pushing the moral frame, Pearl Harbor without a declaration. McNamara kept drawing ladders with rungs the president could stand on. The president held the hinge. He could turn ORTSAC from paper to surf with a phone call. Unknown to the chiefs, Soviet command on the island baked in Predelegation for tactical use if cut off and facing invasion. Jam radios, sever wires, decapitate HQs, the very goals of a smart air campaign, and authority would slide to officers at the gun line with code words and standing orders to repel. Every American success would tighten the trigger. Another micro-story. In a tent near Remedios, a Soviet officer explains by gestures to Cuban militianos where the kill zone lies. He points at a map marked with American beach names he pronounces poorly. He doesn't need the word ORTSAC to understand what's coming. He needs timing, and he's rehearsed for hours. Complications stacked as new U-2 frames rolled in, more MRBM sites, deeper SAM rings, transporters dispersing. Pilots could blind radars and crater strips, but nothing in the folders showed the small launchers under nets. The chief still leaned hard. Kennedy told them the quarantine buys time and leverage. They filed objections and kept transports warm. Impact, if the green light had flashed, would have outpaced politics. Soviet personnel killed in the first strikes would drive Moscow to act somewhere it could, Berlin first. Tactical detonations on Cuban soil would yank strategic air command up the ladder. The plan's neat arrows would smear into a white dome over a beach and a weak nobody could control. The invasion that wasn't stayed that way because the president refused momentum. ORTSAC lived and died on paper. Ships held station instead of charging beaches. Paratroopers stayed on benches, chewing gum they expected to spit out over Cuba. The generals' push never reached the waterline. The brakes held just long enough for a different path to open, one that required backchannels, face-saving, and a secret promise tucked into a calendar halfway around the world. The shootdowns, U-2 over Cuba, and a near-miss over Siberia. Dawn on October 27, 1962, comes thin and metallic. Major Rudolph Anderson seals into his pressure suit at McCoy Air Force Base, the ritual steady. Oxygen hose click, visor down, checklist monotone. His job is simple to say and lethal to do. Climb a U-2 above 70,000 feet, cross Cuba, bring back the frames that settle arguments in Washington. SA-2 sites below aren't symbols anymore. They're crews with orders and a contrail to watch. The stakes ride his wings. Each photo tightens targeting folders or buys hours for bargaining. Each pass over a radar fan gives a Soviet battery commander time to search, acquire, steady. Anderson lifts and climbs into blue so thin it looks brittle. The island spreads like a map beneath him. San Cristobal's ribs, Saguilar Grand's scars, Baines' geometry turning from ink to metal. Action arrives over the east. On the ground near Baines, Soviet air defense officers see the forbidden needle cut across their sky. Senior 75 guidance radar locks on. Orders come fast, shaped by a week of tension and a doctrine that reads violate, and we fire. 2 SA-2s rise, long, white, and blind to politics. One detonates close. Shrapnel rips the U-2's skin, slashes Anderson's suit, blows the cabin's pressure into nothing. He can't feel the fall. The aircraft breaks into a descent. No human can fly. Impact lands in a room that already hums. A courier hands a flimsy. U-2 lost over Cuba, pilot presumed down. The cabinet room stiffens. Curtis LeMay doesn't need a second sentence. In his head, Sam's firing on an American aircraft means immediate strikes. Maxwell Taylor echoes. The chiefs see confirmation of their warnings. Cuba isn't a chessboard, it's a shooting gallery. Kennedy holds the impulse with a palm and a look. McNamara asks 2 blunt questions. Was this from Moscow, and what happens when we answer? Meanwhile, the but therefore chain tightens. The shootdown is an outrage, but if they hit back, they'll kill Soviets. Therefore, Khrushchev may answer in Berlin or worse. RFK speaks the moral line the room can't escape, Pearl Harbor. Kennedy decides, no retaliatory strike today. Keep the quarantine hard. Signal resolve. Hold space for a deal that now has to account for blood. Thousands of miles north, a second fuse hisses. A U-2 weather flight out of Eielson in Alaska drifts off course, jet streams and celestial fixes conspiring to push it over the Chukotka Peninsula into Soviet airspace. On Soviet scopes, a bright dot crosses a line. MiGs scramble. In Alaska, F-102s launch to shepherd their stray home. On their rails, Genie rockets with nuclear warheads designed to tear bomber formations apart in a radiant cone. Controllers talk fast. Bearings, angels, bingo, fuel. For minutes that feel like hours, nuclear-armed aircraft close on nuclear-armed interceptors in the polar sky, each side following orders that don't include panic. The F-102s find the lost glider, bracket it, and guide it south as the MiGs peel at the border. The near-war nobody hears about ends because men follow, do not fire to the comma. Back in Washington, the double jolt cuts grooves. LeMay presses, Sam's sights must go now. McNamara draws ladders again, rungs you can stand on without falling through. The Navy reports ships slowing, turning, stopping under the quarantine. Pressure is working. Then the name arrives, Major Rudolph Anderson, confirmed dead. Kennedy writes to his widow and stares at the sentence he can't change. Grief is private. The calculus stays public. Don't turn one loss into a statistic with too many zeros. What nobody in EXCOMM fully grasps that afternoon, the shootdown likely wasn't a Kremlin order. Local Soviet commanders in Cuba, understanding directives and fear, took a shot they were trained to take. Khrushchev will later say he didn't intend it. That gap, doctrine meeting adrenaline, keeps widening while letters between capitals try to sow a seam. Micro moments fix the day in muscle and memory. In the Arctic twilight, a ground crew chief slides a safety pin back into a Genie and leans against a tire until his hands stop shaking. In Florida, an RF-101 pilot stares at a snapshot of 2 kids before he straps in for a low-level run that might meet an SA-2 fan. At Baines, a radar operator watches the afterglow fade on his scope and pretends his fingers aren't trembling on the console. Meanwhile, the backchannel opens because the cliff edge finally looks like a cliff. Robert Kennedy sits across from Anatoly Dobrynin and offers the shape. Remove the missiles. We pledge not to invade. And quietly, the Jupiters in Turkey go in months. Without Anderson's death, urgency might not harden that fast. With it, both leaders feel how little slack remains. The day ends with two brushes against fire. One that killed a pilot, one that could have sparked a skywide misunderstanding over Siberia. The quarantine holds. Bomb bays stay shut. The letters that will end this begin to find their tone, one personal, one steely. Black Saturday earns its name not because the system worked cleanly, but because men held their hands in place while rage and fear tried to move them. Backchannels and bargains, letters, leaks, and the Turkey missiles. By nightfall on October 27, the public board looked frozen. The real moves clacked through typewriters. Khrushchev sent two letters in two tones. The first, late on the 26th, sounded almost intimate. Remove the missiles if you promise not to invade Cuba. The second, on the 27th, was harder. Take your Jupiter missiles out of Turkey and we have a deal. Two voices, one leader, and a trap. Answer which message. Inside the cabinet room, the stakes got personal. A public trade on Turkey could crack NATO. A flat refusal could crack the planet. Kennedy split the problem. Meet the first letter in public. Answer the second in private. He told his brother to carry the shape in person. No paper, no trail, just a conversation that could buy hours. Robert Kennedy went to the Soviet embassy that night. He sat across from Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and lowered his voice. The offer was clean on the surface. The United States would pledge not to invade Cuba, and once the offensive weapons were removed under verification, the quarantine would end. Then came the quiet part. The Jupiters in Turkey would be removed within months, not as a concession, not announced, but as scheduled modernization. If Moscow needed assurance, this was it. But it couldn't be in any communiqué. Dobrynin heard the door and the cost. He asked timing. Bobby answered soon. He asked guarantees. Bobby said the president was holding back men who wanted war and couldn't hold them forever. He added the line that made the room feel smaller. If this fails, events could move beyond control. The ambassador nodded, note-taking with his eyes instead of a pen, and promised to report immediately. Meanwhile, the White House drafted a public reply keyed only to the first letter. It accepted the non-invasion trade and demanded removal of offensive weapons under inspection. Nothing about Turkey. Llewellyn Thompson, the old Moscow hand, urged answering the personal letter to keep Khrushchev's sense of face. McNamara stressed verification steps, photographs of cranes lifting missiles, ships outbound, inspectors counting crates. The language was clipped on purpose. Don't corner him. Give him a path he can walk. Across the Atlantic, Radio Moscow hammered steel into the public posture. Inside the Kremlin, the split tone reflected split counsel. Some urged standing firm, others urged grabbing the ladder Kennedy offered. Khrushchev paced, dictated, revised. He had leverage, but not for long. The quarantine was working. Ships had turned back. The risk of losing control sat heavy after Anderson's death. The Turkey problem moved like a ghost through Allied halls. The Jupiters were outdated and already slated for removal as Polaris subs assumed the mission, but nobody in Ankara wanted to be the price. Kennedy's team kept the circle tiny, no prior notice beyond a bare minimum, because the leak risk could detonate the deal. Dean Rusk and George Bundy prepped diplomatic cover stories, modernization, alliance cohesion, deterrent unaffected. The truth would live in calendars, not headlines. While leaders wrote, pressure bled into the seams. A journalist close to administration, insiders, floated hints that arrangements regarding Allied missiles might follow, just enough to reach ears in Moscow without printing a map. At the Pentagon, McNamara quietly softened phrasing in guidance that could look like pre-attack preparation. He wasn't blinking, he was buying Kennedy daylight. In Havana, none of this soothed. Castro felt cut out and furious. He de-urged a nuclear response if invaded, and now watched Moscow bargain away missiles without him. Anadyr McCoyan drew an unenviable assignment: fly to Havana, calm the rage, and crucially, persuade Castro to accept removal of tactical warheads too. The Soviets needed all nuclear weapons off the island to make the bargain durable. Castro wanted guarantees he could touch. He got promises and a pat on the shoulder. Back in Washington, the reply went out keyed to the first letter. IFK's verbal assurance to Dobrynin covered the second. Then they waited. The night stretched. SAC stayed on alert. The fleet held position. Low-level flights photographed cranes and revetments, ready to pivot from targeting to verification if the word came. In Moscow, Khrushchev gathered the Presidium and read the political weather. He had two options: escalate and risk war, or declare victory for socialism and step back. The answer broke radio silence the next morning. Khrushchev broadcast that the Soviet Union would dismantle and remove the missiles under UN verification in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. He didn't mention Turkey. Kennedy responded publicly, quarantine easing as removal proceeded, non-invasion pledge on the record. Privately, the White House reaffirmed the Turkey schedule through the channel already opened. Implementation became the new risk. Orders had to travel down chains bent by fear. Captains needed to idle engines, not test lines. Site commanders had to stop building and start packing. Inspectors needed to see enough to convince skeptics without humiliating Soviets whose pride still mattered. The bargain rode human hands. Quietly, the Jupiter dismantlement calendar moved forward. Months later, crews in Turkey unbolted cylinders and stacked parts without speeches. Allies swallowed the change because the alliance held and the deterrent didn't blink. The public saw restraint and verification. The archives would later show a trade, clean in effect, messy in method, that let both leaders claim a kind of victory and left the world breathing. Castro's defiance, Operation Cactus, and the push to use nukes if invaded. Morning after Khrushchev's broadcast, Havana didn't breathe out, it stiffened. Fidel read the wires, heard dismantle, and felt the old burn. Cuba negotiated like a chess piece. A pledge not to invade sounded like paper. He told his commanders to assume the opposite. The Americans would come. Stakes on the island were immediate and personal. Every neighborhood had a militia unit. Every probable beach, Tarara, Kojima, Playa Giron, reborn in memory, had arcs inked in grease pencil. Operation Cactus, Cuba's defense plan, mapped kill zones along sand and roads, wired bridges, cached fuel for scorched earth moves. The goal wasn't to win tidy, it was to make landing ruinous. Action started with dispersal. Cuban batteries slid into groves. T-34s hid under netting near road forks. Infantry dug in around schools turned strongpoints. Soviet advisors walked the lines, low-voiced, precise. They brought more than advice. Tactical nuclear units, FKR-1 coastal missiles and lunar rockets shadowed likely approaches. Their crews rehearsed under canvas, erect, align, arm, wait. Warheads were real, crated under double lock since October 4, 1962, guarded at Bajucal, Managua, Remedios. The Soviets hadn't promised they'd de-stay. The Cubans planned as if they might. Fidel wrote a letter that still stings on the page: if the United States invades, answer with nuclear weapons. Not a first strike out of blue skies, a vow to make the next wave impossible. He'd tasted XL raids and the Bay of Pigs. He didn't trust pledges signed in another capital. His calculus was survival through resolve. If they come, make it unsurvivable. Meanwhile, Anadyr McCoyan landed to soothe and steer. His brief from Moscow had shifted with the radio: remove strategic missiles under verification, and crucially, get nuclear anything off the island fast. He found a leader who felt cut out of his own fate. In meetings, Castro asked if the tactical warheads would remain as a tripwire. McCoyan hedged, then pressed. All nuclear warheads must go. It wasn't about trust. It was about closing the door on accident. Complication grew in the gap between those goals. Cuban command posts planned on the tripwire. Soviet depots planned the extraction. Convoys ran circles, training areas by day, bunkers by night, so no pattern betrayed intent. On a dirt road near the south coast, a Soviet officer pinned a map to a jeep hood under a flap of canvas. FKR arcs swept beaches the Americans had annotated in OPLAN binders. Cuban militianos leaned in, catching only the geometry. They didn't need the words to see the plan. If boots hit that sand, fire first, and don't wait for a phone to ring. Stakes weren't abstract to the Soviet crews either. Predelegation loomed in their checklists. If communications are severed and invasion underway, act to repel. Those words moved authority downhill when artillery cut wires and jamming 8 radios. Commanders rehearsed courier signals and code phrases. They feared a different thing than Fidel did. A decision made at the wrong level in heat that dragged 2 superpowers into a war neither wanted. Action pushed into night. Cuban columns shifted inland with lights taped. Hospitals cleared beds. Radio Havana mixed boleros with defiance. At militia checkpoints, teenagers checked papers with hands steady until the car rolled away. In one cane field, a lunar crew chalked elevation arcs on dirt, while thunder from offshore exercises rolled faint through the leaves. The lieutenant wiped sweat with his sleeve and counted minutes from unmasked to launch. Meanwhile, McCoyan played for time. He charmed, stalled, offered guarantees in phrasing that avoided the word surrender. He argued that leaving tactical warheads risked blowing the deal at sea and handing Washington a pretext. Castro paced, cigar stabbing at air, then agreed to nothing he couldn't see. Trust would be counted by crates leaving docks, not by sentences. Impact of that defiance shaped the stand-down. Soviet units had to keep discipline under a client's fury. Cuban units had to hold fire under insult. The risk was a micro-order turning into a macro-disaster, a flare misread, a patrol skirmish, a battery commander deciding the invasion had started because he heard engines in the dark. In the end, the push to use nukes if invaded wasn't bluster. It was a plan woven into cactus, rehearsed in cane fields and on coastal roads. Moscow tried to unwind it without unraveling the alliance. Havana tried to keep it taut without lighting it. Between them sat warheads in crates, a non-invasion pledge on paper, and a shoreline ready to answer the first splash with a white flash. The warheads, how close the tactical nuclear net was to ready. The quiet danger sat in bermed bunkers that barely cast shadows on film, Bijucal, Managua, Remedios. Low roofs, earth piled high, camo nets hung loose. Inside, nothing was theoretical. Crates were matched to units, codes paired to crews, and drills repeated until hands moved faster than fear. If Marines ever touched Cuban sand, the first answer wasn't going to be artillery. It was going to be nuclear, and soon. Start with the FKR-1 coastal cruise missiles. On paper, they looked modest. Truck launchers, a guidance van, a generator, a handful of tents. In practice, they were beach erasers. Warheads, scores of them, had arrived by October 4, 1962, offloaded from the Indegirka and walked into reinforced rooms under 2-man lock. The mating dance was memorized. Pull the warhead, shroud, move under canvas, bolt to the airframe, verify fusing, hold the final arm step for the last minute. Under calm skies, you could go from load to ready in hours. Under bombardment, officers said quietly less. Layer in the Lunars, the short-range rockets NATO called Frog. Crude, unguided, terrible at finesse, perfect for smashing a staging area into chaos. 12 nuclear warheads were on the island. Launchers hid in mango groves. Crews chalked elevation arcs on dirt and drilled the timing from unmasked to fire. Geography did half their work. Roads ran close behind the beaches. A lunar could be in position before paratroopers finished forming on a runway they thought they owned. Overlap that with the IL-28s. The bombers were old and slow, still assembling on Cuban strips, but 6 gravity bombs sat in inventory. If a runway survived the opening minutes, an IL-28 could make one pass that turned a captured airfield into a cratered memorial. The point of the net wasn't elegance. It was density. Beaches, airfields, junctions, each fell inside somebody's kill zone. Command and control on slides looked crisp. In the field, it blurred on purpose. Officially, Moscow kept nuclear authority. Practically, Predelegation seeped in through phrases meant for chaos. If communications are severed, an invasion underway, act to repel. That wording moved responsibility downhill the moment artillery snapped a line or jamming ate a radio. Couriers rehearsed routes. Code phrases doubled as insurance. The redundancy that kept units lethal also made them independent. Timelines didn't live in weeks, they lived inside a day. An FKR battery could disperse at dusk, mask in a grove before midnight, and be in a firing lane before sunrise. Fire, displace, repeat. A lunar crew could roll from a cane field level and shoot in the time an airborne stick needed to unload and clear a perimeter. American plans assumed suppression. The Soviet plan made suppression the trigger. Kill radios, and you might accelerate the moment a local commander decided to fire. A micro-story plays at Bejewel's edge. A conscript with a dog watched 3 TARP trucks nose past a checkpoint, followed by a van with a crooked star and a jeep. Hours later, 2 trucks came back. He didn't ask. Years on, he told a nephew he never forgot the smell that day, sweet oil and metal the rain couldn't wash. For Washington, the gap was lethal. ORTSAC's first wave had neat arrows, seed runs by Navy and Air Force, paras on San Antonio de los Baños, Marines at Tarará and Kojima, armor pushing inland. It didn't include an FKR sighted for a short arc into those beaches or a lunar crouched 10 kilometers off a captured runway. Even Guantanamo lay in a crosshair. 1 lunar site had it ranged. The chiefs promised low losses if Surprise held. On this net, Surprise walked the tripwire. Meanwhile, the Soviet lattice breathed with the strategic sites. When R-12 regiments raised readiness, tactical units mirrored the posture. Security rings tightened, signal drills doubled, night convoys moved. Warhead crews lived by checklists, seals unbroken, temperature logged, humidity watched, bolts counted. A misstep meant a burnt truck and a secret that would blow the deal. They drilled anyway. You don't go cold because diplomats are busy. Verification would later focus on crane arms and empty revetments. Tactical gear could be boxed by midnight and look like trucks by dawn. McCoyan's mission in Havana turned on this point. To make the bargain stick, all nuclear warheads had to leave. Castro wanted a tripwire left behind. Soviet headquarters wanted none. Convoys looped to hide intent, while arguments ran hot in palaces and tents. The danger hiding in the net was human, not just technical. A colonel with a cut phone and engines in his ears wasn't going to wait for Moscow. His orders said invasion equals repel. His crew had rehearsed the last steps 100 times. The final distance between hold and fire was measured in 2 signatures and a phrase on a field phone that might never ring. So when people call it a 13-day standoff, they miss the hours that mattered. The island was wired. The fuse was short. The plan assumed radios would fail, men would sweat, and decisions would land on the lowest rung where the weapons sat. That's how close the tactical net was, close enough that a beachhead wouldn't have been a battlefield. It would have been a flash. The stand down, how the message finally cut the wire. The morning Khrushchev's broadcast hit radios. Nothing snapped to calm. It shifted. His words were plain: dismantle, remove, verify. But orders don't outrun fear. They crawl through cables, cross decks, and land in hands that spent a week bracing for the first shot. In Moscow, the command chain lit up. Stop construction. Prepare for removal. Maintain discipline. Merchant skippers slowed. Some turned back outright. Others idled outside the quarantine arc, waiting for instructions that wouldn't embarrass anyone with a camera. On Cuban docks, cranes stood ready for the reverse ballet. Crate, lash, lift, under eyes trained to ignore insults so the deal could live. In Washington, Kennedy read the text twice, then said the only strategy that worked now: verify, don't gloat. Publicly, he framed strength meeting strength. The quarantine held. The island would not be invaded. Privately, he told McNamara to keep the line hard but smooth the edges. Boarding parties became inspection teams with clipboards first, sidearms second. The choreography said force with brakes. At sea, the shift felt like unclenching a fist without dropping the guard. A Soviet freighter throttled back inside the arc. A US destroyer matched speed, closed enough to trade flag hoists without posturing. Papers appeared, manifests stamped for machinery, foodstuffs, nothing offensive. The Americans logged, photographed, declined a boarding for optics, and signaled compliant. Farther out, grey hulls rolled in gentle swells, engines ticking over as radio rooms caught up with Moscow's tone. On American bridges, new flimsies arrived. cease contact protocols with submarines, signaling charges only for safety, no buzzing surfaced boats. XOs folded the papers and walked them into sonar, where operators widened the space between pings like men coaxing nervous animals. The ocean's percussion softened. No cheers, just discipline. Meanwhile, in Cuban barracks, calm didn't take. Castro heard dismantle and felt the old humiliation. He demanded clarity on the tactical warheads. Would the Soviets leave anything? Anastas Mikoyan, the fixer with a smile, had to deliver the line that closed the fuse. All nuclear warheads go. He said it gently, then firmly. Castro paced, cigar stabbing like punctuation, and agreed to nothing he couldn't see. Implementation risk lived in the gap between orders and terrain. A Soviet site commander received the stand-down mid-drill. He froze the exercise, remasked launchers, and sent men to drape nets. Across the road, a Cuban company, uninformed and suspicious, watched the Russians hide hardware and thought they were cheating the pledge. A lieutenant clicked his safety off. His captain stared him down and said 2 words, "Not today." A micro-story rides a Jacob's ladder. A US boarding team practiced a dozen times now steps onto a slow-moving Soviet deck. The captain meets them calm, documents ready. Crates under tarps sit in neat ranks. No long cylinders, no telltale vans. Photos taken. Polite nods traded. The Americans descend, boots slick with spray, and radio the word everyone wants: clear. Verification became the currency. Low-level flights traced arcs over San Cristobal, Sagua La Grande, and Guanaje, snapping cranes lifting R-12s, transporters lined like beetles with their shells off, revetments emptying by the day. The Navy held the ring as inspectors counted shadows and rivets. In Langley, analysts compared mosaics and ticked boxes. Evidence, not boasts, would sell this at home and abroad. In bunker towns, Bijucal, Managua, Remedios, checklists walked warheads back out. 2-man rules, seals unbroken, temperatures logged, codes matched to crates. A quartermaster with a pencil stub checked boxes he'd checked 100 times forward. Now he checked them backward. A truck emerged lighter by 1 crate. Guards looked away by reflex, then glanced back, wanting proof in motion. Across the Alliance, the quiet half of the bargain slid onto calendars. The Jupiters in Turkey would go within months, dismantled without speeches, explained as modernization, while Polaris took the watch. Ankara grumbled in private. NATO held because deterrence didn't blink, and no one had to read a headline that said trade. Complications kept flickering. Hardliners in both capitals muttered about capitulation. A Cuban battery commander requisitioned fuel for training and got a visit from a Soviet colonel who talked him out of a live-fire drill with a stare. At Guantanamo, Marines kept helmets near bunks while A4s cooled on the line. The posture relaxed by inches, not yards. Impact traveled fastest in the places that had been hottest. On a destroyer's sonar stack, the room's tone dropped half an octave. On B-59's deck, men felt air without tasting metal. In the cabinet room, a president allowed himself 1 breath between calls. In Moscow, a leader told his circle that socialism had stood tall and secured peace, and to get the missiles moving now. The wire didn't cut clean. It frayed, then parted because enough hands worked down the line to keep tension from becoming heat. Captains eased throttles. Sergeants stood squads down. Photo interpreters counted emptiness. A Soviet crane operator swung a missile into a crate like it was any other load and wiped his palms. The crisis ended the way it had hidden for weeks, in logistics, restraint, and men choosing control over pride. Aftermath and fallout, what we learned and what we misread. When the cranes finished their reverse ballet and grey hulls faded over the horizon, officials reached for a tidy story. They told themselves the system held cool heads, steady hands, a quarantine that worked, a backchannel that closed the loop. The record says something rougher. Institutions adapted because people felt the cliff. The first fix was speed. A direct hotline linked Washington and Moscow in 1963 so letters wouldn't crawl while missiles could sprint. That cable was an admission. The last crisis moved too fast for typewriters. Next came the limited test ban treaty, moving the biggest blasts underground and signaling that both sides knew they danced too close to fire. Inside the Pentagon, positive control became a mantra. Extra locks, stricter two-man rules, and new checklists wrapped anything nuclear. Control, twice checked, was the postscript to October. Meanwhile, Declassifications decades later rewrote the internal story. The underwater piece emerged first. 4 Foxtrot submarines had carried nuclear torpedoes. B-59's vote mattered because it was a vote at all. The Navy's signaling, pings and practice charges looked different once you added a 10-15 kiloton torpedo to the deck plan. Robert McNamara would later read the torpedo detail and call it terrifying. In 1962, the variable didn't exist in any White House memo. The island's hidden lattice came into view next. CIA estimates in October put Soviet troop strength at 10 to 12,000. The archives showed more than 40,000 Soviet combat troops embedded, plus Cuban units layered tight. Tactical nuclear weapons, FKR coastal missiles, lunar rockets, a handful of gravity bombs for IL-28s were real and rehearsed. If Marines had landed at Tarará or Parras, seized San Antonio de los Baños, the first hour might have ended in a white flash. ORTSAC's clean arrows would have dissolved in heat and smoke Washington hadn't budgeted into its losses. Public memory clung to a clean sequence. Photos, quarantine, letters, deal. Private memory among the people who touched the files hardened into something else. Luck checked by discipline, accidents contained by inches, and individuals who refused momentum at the hinge. George Bundy walking photos to a robe-wearing president. Kennedy telling 4 stars no while SAC engines idled. RFK offering a quiet turkey calendar in a diplomat's office. Anatoly Dobrinin carrying a promise he couldn't write. Vasili Arkhipov holding a key in place while a hull rang. Major Rudolf Anderson flying the mission that shaped the bargain under grief. Allies learned their own hard truths. NATO swallowed the Turkey missile removal because it arrived as modernization, not concession. Deterrence didn't blink. Polaris picked up the watch. The lesson was narrow and uncomfortable. Alliances can absorb secrets if the secret makes everyone safer. Stretch that lesson, and it snaps. Leaders who tried to replay the Cuba script later found different maps and no Arkhipov waiting off stage. Backchannels earned both respect and suspicion. The crisis ended because a private assurance moved when public postures couldn't. But secrecy leaves residue. Castro's exclusion carved a resentment that reshaped Havana's posture for years. Militarize deeper, trust less, prepare to fight alone. In Moscow and Washington, hardliners carried their own grievances forward. Some saw capitulation, others saw victory stolen from the edge. Institutional fixes helped but didn't immunize. Exercises added political white cells to force decision friction into war games. Command trees emphasized unambiguous authority. Yet in 1983, Abel Archer spooked Moscow into thinking a drill looked like a prelude. Radios still fail. People still guess under pressure. October 1962 wasn't a vaccine. It was a case study too many skimmed. Micro-lessons stuck where doctrine couldn't reach. A sonarman who mistook whales for screws pushed for better oceanographic charts on patrol routes. A photo interpreter who circled a SAM fan taught a generation to treat the word defensive like a variable, not a shield. A destroyer XO saved the flimsy that eased contact with subs and told junior officers that standing down with discipline is a combat skill. Meaning settles here. Systems offer lanes. People choose turns. The crisis didn't prove the ladder of escalation is sturdy. It showed the rungs are radios, habits and hands, things that slip. The leaders who survived October learned to buy time, to leave doors open, to trade quietly when public trades break coalitions. They also learned how much they didn't know at the moment of choice. What we misread was our own certainty. Analysts trimmed irrational options from estimates because they felt wrong. Doctrine assumed dictionaries matched across languages and steel. Plans treated unknowns like rounding errors. The archives gave those unknowns names: B-59, FKR, Luna, and Faces. The next time someone in a room says, "They wouldn't do that," the right answer is another question. Who's they? What's that? And how hot is the room? Return to the sub, the vote that saved the world. back to the steel tube where the air tasted like coins and the bulkheads sweated. B-59 rode the edge, voltage sagging, CO2 climbing, men moving in slow motion. Above, practice charges cracked shallow. To the destroyer crews, those pops were punctuation. To the sailors inside, they were hammers. Stakes were immediate and final. The special, in the green safe, a T-5 nuclear torpedo of roughly 10-15 kilotons, could erase a destroyer group in one white flash. That blast wouldn't stay local. Strategic Air Command was on alert. A sun underwater would look like a first strike. Washington would lurch toward LeMay's playbook. Moscow, seeing a catastrophe at sea, would face pressure to answer in Europe. One key turn could turn a misread into a continental fire. Action inside B-59 moved in jolts. Captain Valentin Savitsky read the pattern as attack. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, had half a key and a doctrine that said defend the boat if you're under attack, if cut off when war starts, act. The radio was silent. The hull rang. He nodded toward the safe. Hands hovered. Here's where a procedural quirk mattered. On B-59, unanimity was required. Captain, political officer, and brigade chief of staff. Vasili Arkhipov held that third vote. He carried scars from K-19, where a reactor leak cooked men to keep a ship alive. He'd seen fear turn judgment into noise. He looked at Savitsky's clenched jaw, felt the heat, heard the thuds, and set a simple wall. No. He didn't grandstand. He argued facts. Those charges were shallow. If the Americans meant to kill the boat, the pattern and depth would be different. The batteries were dying. Without air, the diesels couldn't save them. Surfacing would answer the only question that mattered, signal or attack, without writing an ending they couldn't undo. He asked for one more turn to cooler water, one more hour, then a decision in light, not heat. Impact hinged on minutes. The torpedo crew had already broken paper seals on tools. A runner had the word prepare in his mouth. The doctor shoved salt tablets at men whose hands shook. An engineer gave numbers, voltage, CO2 like verdicts. Savitsky slammed a fist into the bulkhead. Maslenikov's eyes flicked to the safe. Arkhipov held his vote in place and tethered it to math, blow tanks or black out. They blew tanks. The boat exhaled. Plates creaked. The bow climbed from dark into a riot of rotor wash, flares, flags, and shouted English. Sailors stumbled into sun like men waking inside an oven. On American bridges, binoculars found faces, not guns. No ramming, no boarding. Signals, distance, caution. The destroyers circled like wolves that just been told to heel. The safe stayed shut. Clarify why this mattered. Washington didn't know those subs carried nuclear torpedoes. The Navy's signaling doctrine assumed a shared dictionary of risk. Add a 10-15 kiloton option to a cornered captain, and that dictionary breaks. Robert McNamara would later read the torpedo detail and call it terrifying. In October 1962, the variable wasn't in any briefing. A micro-story stayed aft. A torpedo man stared at the green hatch and thought about the paper seals he just split. The count order, hold, reached him like a hand on his shoulder. Years later, he'd tell a nephew he never again heard a door latch without feeling that hinge. Meanwhile, other Foxtrots, B-36, B-130, B-4, fought the same heat and doubt. On those boats, 2 signatures could have sufficed. On B-59, it took 3. That quirk met a man with a long memory and a steady voice. He did save the world with rhetoric. He bought time, 10 minutes, then an hour, until air and light turned fists on a hull into signals on a horizon. B-59 slid back under, nursing batteries toward cooler layers. Elsewhere, letters hardened into offers, cranes prepared for reverse choreography, and camera lenses waited to count empty revetments. But the crisis didn't just break in embassies. It bent here, in a compartment that smelled like diesel and metal, where one vote held a key in place long enough for restraint to find daylight. The wire held because a few people chose friction over speed under heat they could feel. If you want the unseen decisions that still govern today's close calls, subscribe and stay with us. Watch next. The spy inside the KGB who turned submarines into glass, and why that secret still shapes every standoff you'll hear about tomorrow.